At 9:13 in the morning on October 21, 1966, a mountain of black waste began to move. It had been raining for weeks, and no one was watching. In less than 5 minutes, more than 100,000 tons of coal sludge swept down a Welsh hillside and swallowed a school full of children. When the mountain finally stopped, 144 people were dead. 116 of them were children, most between the ages of 7 and 10. Almost an entire generation of one small street, gone in under 300 seconds. And the organization responsible had been warned in writing 7 years before it happened, told explicitly that this exact disaster was possible. This is the story of Aberfan, a tragedy that wasn't an accident of nature. It was a decision, made and remade for years, to ignore what everyone could see coming. Aberfan was a small coal mining village tucked into a valley in South Wales, home to about 5,000 people. Like almost every family in town, life revolved entirely around the Merthyr Vale colliery, the coal mine that had employed generations of the same families for over a century. Fathers, sons, and grandsons worked the same shafts. It was, in every sense, a company town, and the village trusted the company that ran it. Coal mining doesn't just produce coal. It produces enormous amounts of waste rock, shale, and slurry that has to go somewhere. For decades, the National Coal Board had been dumping that waste on the mountainside directly above the village, piling it higher and higher into what were called tips. There were 7 of these tips above Aberfan by the 1960s. Tip number 7, the one that mattered most, was built directly on top of a hillside known to contain natural underground springs. Springs marked clearly on old geological survey maps that the Coal Board had access to. Anyone who had studied the local geology could have told you that piling wet, unstable waste on top of running water was a mistake. But nobody asked, and nobody checked. By the mid-1960s, Tip 7 had grown to more than 30 meters tall, a black mountain looming over rows of terraced houses, and at the bottom of the slope, Pantglas Junior School. Local residents weren't blind to the danger. Children in the village used to talk about the tip moving after heavy rain, describing how the ground beneath it seemed to breathe. In 1963, a smaller slip from the same tip had already crept toward the edge of the village, burying part of a road and frightening residents enough that some raised the alarm formally. That same year, a civil engineer inspected the site and wrote a formal letter to the Coal Board, warning them in explicit, technical terms that the tips were unstable, built on flowing groundwater, and posed a serious risk to the community below. It wasn't an anonymous complaint or a rumor passed around the village pub. It was a professional, documented, signed warning, delivered directly to the people responsible for the tip. The letter was filed away. No engineering survey was ordered. No drainage was installed to redirect the springs. No one from the Coal Board ever visited the site to check the claims in person. The mine kept dumping waste on the same unstable ground, tip after tip, for 3 more years, as if the letter had never been written at all. By October 1966, autumn had brought weeks of relentless rain to the valley, some of the heaviest rainfall the region had seen in years. Water soaked into the loose, unconsolidated waste of Tip 7, and something happened inside that mountain that no one on the surface could see. The compacted rock and shale began to turn into something closer to liquid, saturated from within by the very springs the engineer had warned about years earlier. Weight that had once been stable was now floating on a hidden layer of water, held in place by nothing more than gravity and habit. Still, no inspection was carried out. There was no monitoring system, no alarm, no one whose job it was to walk up the slope and check the tip after a week of rain. The mine simply kept operating as it always had, shift after shift, as if the ground above the village were as solid as it looked from below. On the morning of October 21st, a thick fog rolled through the valley, so dense that the top of Tip 7 was completely hidden from the village below. a wall of gray that made the mountain disappear entirely. It was a Friday, the last school day before half-term holiday, which meant an atmosphere of excitement among the children who were looking forward to a week off. At Pantglas Junior School, around 240 students had just filed into their classrooms, hanging up coats, settling into rows of wooden desks. In one room, children were singing the hymn All Things Bright and Beautiful, a hymn about the natural world, about mountains and rivers, sung by children who had no idea the mountain above them was already failing. It was 9:13 in the morning. High above them, hidden completely in the fog, the waterlogged mass of Tip 7 had finally reached its breaking point. At 9:13, the tip collapsed. Over 100,000 tons of coal waste broke free all at once and transformed into a roaring river of black slurry, moving down the mountainside at terrifying speed. Witnesses said it sounded like a jet engine, or a low, continuous thunder that shook the ground before anyone could see what was coming through the fog. The wave tore first through a farm and a row of cottages in its path, killing the families inside almost instantly, before it even reached the village proper. It crossed a rail line, snapping the tracks apart like twigs, and then, seconds later, it hit Pantglas Junior School. The force of the slurry caved in walls and collapsed the roof, burying classrooms under as much as 9 meters of waste in a matter of seconds. Inside, the hymn stopped mid-verse. Survivors, the few who managed to escape or were pulled out in time, described a deafening roar, then sudden darkness, then a silence more terrifying than the noise that came before it, a silence broken only by the sound of digging. Word spread through the village almost instantly. Miners from the nearby colliery, still in their work clothes, still covered in coal dust from their shift, ran straight from the pit into the wreckage and began digging with their bare hands, boots, and shovels. Parents sprinted from their homes toward the school, some still in their night clothes, tearing at the black sludge with anything they could find: coal shovels, kitchen tools, their fingers bleeding from broken nails. But the material behaved almost like quicksand. It was thick, heavy, saturated, and unstable, collapsing back into the hole as fast as rescuers could dig it out. Digging by hand through waste that dense, searching for children buried beneath it, took hours that felt like days, and by the time heavy machinery arrived, most of what could be done had already been done by hand, by neighbors and strangers working side by side. By the end of that terrible morning and the search that followed, the final toll stood at 144 dead. 116 were children, most of them between 7 and 10 years old, nearly half of all the children at that school. In some households on the same street, every single child was gone, and some families lost more than one. The official tribunal that followed spent months examining what had happened, hearing testimony from engineers, miners, and coal board officials. Its conclusion was blunt and unambiguous. The disaster was entirely avoidable, caused by what the report called a total absence of a tipping policy, and a culture within the National Coal Board that had ignored years of documented warnings from its own engineers and from the community. The blame, the tribunal said clearly, lay entirely with the organization, not with nature, not with bad luck, not with an act of God. And yet, incredibly, not a single person was fired, demoted, or criminally prosecuted. No one went to prison. No one lost their job. The chairman of the coal board kept his position for years afterward and offered what many in the village considered a hollow, procedural apology. Perhaps most staggering of all, in the aftermath, the coal board quietly used money from a public disaster relief fund, donations sent from around the world, from ordinary people who wanted to help grieving families rebuild their lives, to help pay for the removal of the remaining dangerous tips around the village. Money meant for the survivors of a disaster was redirected to clean up the very negligence that caused it in the first place. It took more than 30 years and sustained public pressure from survivors and campaigners, before that money was finally repaid to the fund in full, a small, delayed measure of justice for a wrong that could never truly be undone. Aberfan changed British law. It led directly to new legislation governing the safety of mining waste tips across the country, requiring regular inspection and independent oversight that simply hadn't existed before. It remains one of the defining case studies in industrial safety and corporate accountability, still taught in engineering and ethics courses today, a permanent reminder of what happens when a warning is filed away instead of acted on. Today, the site where Pantcliffe School once stood is a quiet memorial garden. Nearby, on the hillside above the village, facing the very slope that once collapsed on them, row after row of small white gravestones mark where the children are buried, many of them side by side with siblings, classmates, and friends, their names and ages carved in stone, most no older than 10. Every year on October 21st, the village of Aberfan still holds a moment of silence at 9:13 in the morning. The school bell that survived the disaster is rung once for every life lost. Not because they've forgotten, because they never will. If a warning ignored on paper can cost over 100 lives, imagine what happens when the warning comes from the sky itself. Subscribe, because next time, we're covering an explosion heard from 800 kilometers away, with no bomb and almost nothing left behind to explain it.